Of course, Father Greg Boyle is an American Roman Catholic priest in the Jesuit order. Our Jesuit brother, welcome to the Marianist family. He's the founder and director of Homeboy Industries, the world's largest gang intervention and rehabilitation program, and former pastor of Dolores Mission Church in Los Angeles. In a nation deeply divided and plagued by poverty and violence, Father Greg offers a snapshot into the challenges and joys of life on the margins. A moving example of unconditional love during difficult times. The opportunity to have Father Greg with us, it's guaranteed to certainly shake up some ideas and bring forth wonderful, wonderful, and much needed dialogue. Father Greg has 3 decades of working with gang members in LA, and all this experience not only teaches him, but then it teaches us about faith, compassion, and the enduring power of kinship. And he also, of course, will invite us to find that kinship with one another and reconvinces us of all of our goodness. So I'm just going to hand it over to Father Greg Boyle. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It's a privilege to be with you. I'm an expert on nothing, but I have worked with gang members for 35 years, so I guess folks thought that made me eminently suited to address this lay assembly. I want to dedicate my hour and a half to my brothers and friends, Brandon and Michael, Marianists who will be ordained in St. Louis on August 22, and this one is for them. So I think I would divide this into 3 parts, God, self, and community, and then, dedicate the last half hour or more to your questions or comments. So I'm gonna encourage you right now to have that intentionality, to have a pen and pad of paper where you can write down something so that you can fire away questions and comments when I've finished yakking. This is an odd forum, I'm sort of getting used to it somewhat, doing this virtually, and I kind of like the feel of a room, and I like people laughing, and so anyway, I've adapted, as we all have, during this time. So I want to talk about God. First of all, there's nothing more consequential really than our notion of God. Not God, but our notion of God. Because our notion of God is the thing that it sort of drives the vehicle. It's the engine, really. And so everything is utterly dependent on how we see God. And we know that this is eternally true, that if our God is puny or restrictive or exacting or mean, or the list is long, then we're going to be that in the world. And the invitation is always to be in the world who God is, compassionate, loving, and kind. I'm a Jesuit, so I'm a son of Ignatius, as they say. So St. Ignatius always talked about take care to keep always before your eyes first God. And it's not just about God, it's about how we conceive of God. And certainly the secret of the ministry of Jesus was that God was at the center of it. And so we have to know, well, what God is at the center of it. Meister Eckhart, a theologian and mystic who lived a long time ago, often said, it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And that's worth exploring, because there's something in us that actually doesn't believe that in the same way as preachers were meant to, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, we think that that's God's agenda too, to comfort us and to afflict us. And yet I think he's on to something when he says it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. Ignatius also talks about the God who's always greater. So we want to find this notion of God that's expansive and spacious and worthy of our God. My friend Annie Lamott always says, you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. And so we don't want to create God in our own image, but it is in fact what we do. So I had a spiritual director years ago say to me, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit, but he of course was right, because we've settled for what Richard Rohr calls a partial God, and we don't want to settle for that. We want something more expansive. The homies have always taught me everything of value, and the list is long. But I remember one of the things I missed so much because of the pandemic is it's been almost 5 months, I guess, since I've gone to detention facilities, and I'm in all 25 of them here in the county of Los Angeles, probation camps and juvenile halls. I have twice taped a mass to be transmitted into those facilities, but it's not the same thing. But years ago, I was at a juvenile hall, San Fernando Juvenile Hall in Sylmar. And, it was in those days we were in a big gym, and there were like 500 gang members in there. And they have these hojas, these sheets that have the readings in English and in Spanish. And so you can follow along. And I thought, well, I'm going to rest this sheet on my lap. I'm vested in my alb and my stole. And I'm going to just listen to the word proclaimed. And so the first homie got up from the crowd of gang members, mainly all gang members, and he did the first reading. And then the second homie got up to do the responsorial psalm. And there was, I don't know, a kind of an overabundance of confidence in his proclamation. And he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I thought, what the hell? And I looked at the sheet, and it said, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking instantly, that's way better than the exalted God. Because the exalted God, if we're honest, is a human creation. It's our invention. It's creating God in our own image. There isn't a human being who has ever walked this earth that if you were God, you would hope to be exalted, that every knee would bend and every tongue would wag or every head would bow. This is what humans would want if they were God, hence our invention of it. But an exhausted God is way better. We can connect to that, actually. Any parent, any grandparent knows what it's like to be exhausted, to have given of yourself, to be generous, to be self-emptying, to be absorbed in the other. It's like the grandparent, who's, when you ask, how you doing? I say, well, I'm so beat, I'm so tired. I'm exhausted because I had my grandkids with me this weekend or whatever. And then they will say, it's a good tired. Yeah, our God is sort of exhausted in a good tired way, expansive, magnanimous, extensive towards us. The exhausted God is a better God than the one we have. And there is nothing more consequential than our notion and image of God, because whatever it is you have, it's going to be the engine that drives your vehicle. And it's important to refine it all the time, which is kind of the task. None of us believes in the God the God of our third grade Baltimore Catechism. We don't really connect with that anymore because we've grown and our notion has grown. And that's a very good thing because you want to refine it. You want to get to it. A couple of years ago, I buried my 92-year-old mama, and she lived to that ripe old age, and she died in her own home, surrounded by her kids. She had 8 kids, 5 girls and 3 boys. I buried my father some 27 years ago, and she was not even a lick afraid of dying. In fact, a couple of weeks before she died, she was kind of exhilarated. She was excited. She said, "I've never done this before." Like it's something you might have said just before skydiving. In fact, the day before she died, I was at her bedside, which was very rare that I'd be the only one there, and I was. And she was asleep. And when she woke up, she saw me there and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." And she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed that she was still alive, sorry. So, but the next day, as again, luck would have it, all my sisters who were there went out to go get lunch, bring it back. And I was sitting with her and she again was asleep, and it was exactly at noon. And she opened her eyes and she let out this wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And she left us. And no one in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I was recalling that in the last week or so of her life, my siblings, my brothers and sisters, 2 or 3 or all 8 of us would be standing around her bed, and she'd be in and out of consciousness, and she had been, smart as a whip to the very end. In fact, she watched so much MSNBC. She was becoming Rachel Maddow. And so she was sharp, but she was running out of gas. And so, but she would go in and out of consciousness. But when she came to, she would lock on to one of us and she would say with breathless delight, "Oh, you're here. You're here." And I recalled that as we were burying her, that I think that may well be the singular agenda item of the God we have, to look us in the eyes and say with breathless delight, "Oh, you're here. You're here." We have this notion of Jesus in the desert and, 40 days and 40 nights, and this becomes our Lent, and dark night of the soul, and growling stomach, and maybe despair and despondent and doubts, and maybe he's wondering, should he have given up chocolate and scotch for Lent? Whatever it is, we think it's kind of an ordeal, but I suspect what it was 40 days and 40 nights of God looking at his beloved Son in whom he's wonderfully pleased and saying only, "You're here. You're here." And of course, the only response to that, to God, is to say, "You're here." And there's nothing more consequential in our lives than to know this exhausted God who says repeatedly, "You're here." Find the image, even now, as your own, if you're half listening to me, find the image in your own heart. I remember there was a Jesuit friend of mine named Bill who had to leave his teaching job to go and at that point he was the only one around, and he took care of his father who was actively dying of cancer, and he took full care of him. No nurses or anything. He carried his father from his bed and bathed him and took care of him in the bathroom and fed him. And again, his father was quite sharp too. And so he, every night he would put him to bed. And Bill, in this role reversal that happens often, he read to his father in the same way his father read to him when he was a kid. And Bill would read, and Bill was exhausted after taking care of his father. And his father would just stare at his son and smile. And Bill would look up reading, a big Russian novel or something. And he'd get a little annoyed. He would say, hello, bedtime, fall asleep. I'm reading to you so that you will fall asleep. And the father said, okay. And his father would close his eyes initially, and then one eye would pop open because he couldn't take his eyes off his kid. And this went back and forth, and Bill recalled that after he had buried his father, that this too was God's agenda. Behold the one beholding you and smiling, the God who can't take God's eyes off of you. And so we receive the tender glance from God who says, you're here, so that we can be in the world who God is, tender glance, so that we can behold and smile. A friend of mine, Mirabai Starr, who's a mystic herself, but she writes books about mystics and translates them. She says, once you know the God of love, fire all the other gods, which is good advice. Once you know the God of love, you fire the God that allows you, for example, to separate children from their parents at the border. Fire that God. And once you know the God of love, you fire the God that permits you to pack a church during a pandemic. Get rid of that God. And once you know the God of love, you fire the God that thinks there's some kind of human hierarchy out there, that some races are superior to others. Hand that God marching papers. Once you know the God of love, everything changes. And then you discover that our God has a limited vocabulary. In fact, our God is monosyllabic. Love. I'm afraid that's it. There was a homie named Johnny. We all called him Johnny Bravo because he was a posturer. He always pretended he was tougher than the average bear. He was kind of a teddy bear, actually. But it was always in posture mode. And I can remember 20 years ago, I was locking my office on First Street, and I was startled by him, and he kind of tapped me on the shoulder, and he was saying, I don't have any money, I haven't eaten, and my stomach's on échale, empty. And I said, well, my wallet's on échale, so get in the car. So I drove him over to Food for Less and tried to you know, hopefully trick the ATM out of giving me some money. But he's a kind of a troublemaker, and he's got a big mouth, and I don't know who might run into at the Food for Less. So I say, hey, do me a favor, stay here. I'm gonna run in real quick. So I'm 10 feet away from the car when I hear this kind of muffled, hey, and I turn around and it's Johnny, and he's making señales, and he's going, the keys, the radio, and I go, chale ni mangos, I'm not giving you the keys to my car. Are you out of your mind? So I go like this, pray. And he rolls his eyes and he makes a big cara de fushi, and he pretends like he's praying, which I think was charming and funny. So then I go in and I get $20 and I come out of the Food for Less. I get in the car. I don't know how to explain this, except that you can tell that some energy has been galvanized, that something's happened. And I said, you prayed, didn't you? And he just nods quietly, and he's never quiet, and he's never reflective, and he just nods. So I'm gonna drive him to get something to eat, and I said, how do you see God? And he said, damn, gee, that's my dog right there, meaning best friend. And he said, I don't know where I'd be without him. And then I said, well, how does God see you? So I'm driving and he's silent, and I get to a red light and I turn to him, and he is leaning his head against the headrest. And I noticed this lone solitary tear roll down his cheek. And then he said, God thinks I'm firme. And firme means could not be one bit better. You are my beloved, God says to us, and not just Jesus, in whom I am wonderfully pleased. And so our exhausted monosyllabic God, love, that's it. Tender glance, tender glance. I have a spiritual director now named Sergio. He's a homie, 10 years addicted to meth and was in prison for a stretch. Now he's clean, has a job even during this pandemic in a warehouse, an essential worker, married, 3 daughters. And he emails me every morning, usually multiple times. That's how our spiritual direction, I suppose it's mutual, happens. And we'll each email the other about whatever the heck is going on and how we think God, what's on God's mind in our lives. So he emailed me and he said, you know, I was driving home from work and I was just filled with gratitude that I had a job, that I was in recovery, that I was clean and sober, that I didn't gangbang anymore, that I have a wife who I love, and my 3 daughters who are treasures to me. And I don't know what it was, he says, but I was filled with absolute gratitude. And so my whole being, my whole soul was rushing to express this to God. And then he says this, but God beat me to the punch. And God thanked me for allowing myself to be loved. And that's the exhausted God. That is the mystic's view of the God of love. And that is a better God than the one we have. And there is nothing more consequential than knowing this God who beats you to the punch and thanks you for allowing yourself to be loved. Let me take a time out and just say just two things about kind of who I am, I guess, or where I'm coming from. Homeboy Industries has been around now for 32 years. It was born in the housing projects of Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission. It had 8 gangs in those 2 housing projects, all at war with each other. And the LAPD said that my parish had the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city. So if LA was the gang capital of the world, my parish was the gang capital of Los Angeles. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. And a week ago, I buried my 235th, a young man named Maynard Aguirre. Not all of those folks are from the parish, obviously, but I run a very large gang intervention program, so I get saddled and invited and honored to bury them. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many junior high, middle school age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school, didn't have anywhere to go. So I walked out into the projects and I would approach the gang members and I'd say, hey, isolating them a little bit. I go, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, every single one said, yeah, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them. So that sort of forced my hand. So up on the 3rd floor of our elementary school across the street from the church, the whole floor of this huge building was the convent where the nuns lived. And so I sat them down one evening in their living room and I said, hey, you know, would you guys mind, you know, moving out and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members? And they looked at each other and they said, sure. And that was the entire extent of their discernment process. And so we started a school for gang members, which brought all these enemies, rivals to our church property, and which created something of a disconnect. You know, people in the parish started to say, you know, excuse me, Padre, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? You know, good people in and bad people out, which was, I thought, a good gospel challenge. And then the gang members in short order start saying, you know, if only we had jobs. And so myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers. And that wasn't so forthcoming. So we just invented things. We started these crews, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a graffiti removal crew, and a crew to build our child care center, all made up of members of the 8 rival gangs from the parish. And in 1992, after the Rodney King verdict, every pocket of poverty just exploded. And that is every pocket of poverty except the poorest parish in the city. And so the LA Times wanted to know why that was. And so they asked me and I said, I don't know, I think maybe it's because we have 60 strategically hired rival gang members who have a reason to get up in the morning, and more importantly, a reason not to gangbang the night before. And maybe that is the reason. Well, the article appeared, and a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million, read the article, and he summoned me to his Beverly Hills office, and he said, "What should I do with my money?" And as I look back on it now, I can see that I woefully undershot my request. But anyway, I said, you know, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from our school. You could buy it. It's got ovens. They don't work, but you could fix them. I don't know, we could put hair nets on rival enemy gang members. They could bake bread. We could call it Homeboy Bakery. And that was the entire extent of my business plan. And he said yes, and so we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market in downtown LA. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this. And not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. That just went right over my head. So, and now nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we have backed our way. We've evolved our way into now becoming the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program on our planet. So 15,000 folks walk through our doors every year, pre-pandemic anyway, and they're trying to imagine some hope. And so most of them want to get into our 18-month training program, which is the centerpiece, is really about healing. And so everybody's in therapy. We have 47 therapists, including 2 psychiatrists. Only 5 of those are paid. The rest are volunteers. Free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. We have a designated clinic, 3 laser machines. We have classes, case managers, navigators, and 9 social enterprises, from bakery to homegirl cafe to homeboy diner to a restaurant at LAX, silk screening, electronic recycling. Homeboy wants to stand with the poor and the powerless and at the margins. If you stand at the margins, you look under your feet, the margins are getting erased because you chose to stand there. You don't go to the margins to bring folks to the center. You go to the margins so that you can stay out at the margins with the easily despised and the readily left out. You go out to the margins to stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. You go to the margins, all of us, so that we can stand with the demonized, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. You stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And you brace yourself whenever you go to the margins, because people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." you go to the margins and other voices get heard. Everyone who walks through our doors at Homeboy Industries comes with what psychologists call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening, and you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. Every single person walks through the doors of Homeboy barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace. And the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness, which is the highest form of spiritual maturity. Tender glance. And you want to hold the mirror up and tell folks the truth, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. The Buddhists say, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." One of my favorite Christmas carols is "O Holy Night," and it says, "Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared, and the soul felt its worth." And yeah, it's a story about Jesus. And yeah, it's a story about Christmas. But how is it not the job description of every Marianist lay volunteer? You appear, and the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. Oh, nobly born. The homies always say they're used to being watched. They're not used to being seen. They're not used to being greeted and people saying with their whole soul and being, "You're here. You're here." And so the tender glance that we receive from our exhausted God becomes the tender glance that we extend to others. The principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout Scripture is shame and disgrace. And how do you dismantle those messages so that people can get at the truth? In the Acts of the Apostles, it has this odd line, and it says simply, "And awe came upon everyone." And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. A number of years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and it was what they call a gang in-service. And I participated in a lot of those over the years. A bunch of social workers take over the ballroom of a hotel, and it's 9 to 5, and you get credits for showing up. And it's a gang in-service, has keynotes and workshops and breakout sessions to explain what this gang phenomenon is, and experts come from all over. And so I said yes, and I, figuring maybe I'll do a keynote or something to begin the thing or end the thing or at lunch. So I bought my ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pulled out the original invitation letter, and to my horror, I discovered that I was going to be the only speaker all damn day, 9 to 5. And I said to myself, oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker. So I called two homies in, two trainees from our 18-month training program. Andre, an African-American who worked in the bakery, and Jose, who was both of them part of our 18-month training program. And Jose was part, kind of at that phase, he was working with our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. And now he was helping younger homies with their addiction issues. So I sit the two of them down and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories before. And Jose got up first. And he was 25 years old, tattooed, gang member, been to prison. But also now in recovery, as I mentioned, and helping younger folks with their addiction issues. And so he not only did a stretch in prison, but he also had a long time as a homeless man and an even longer period as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers in this ballroom and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we never got along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And we got whiplash. Everybody started laughing. And I can't recall ever going from gasp to laugh quite like that before. And then he continued. He said, I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks up to an orphanage and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could rescue me and save me from this. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine, and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and the second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded So we have a God who is tender and monosyllabic and is exhausted and only cares about love. And so we want to see as God does and align ourselves with this God of love and fire all the other gods. And then we want to be in the world who this God is, tender. And we want to go to the margins so that we all inhabit together with exquisite mutuality the truth of who we are, that we're exactly what God had in mind when God made us. Oh, nobly born. And that's who we are. And the point of the mystic is to see ourselves as God does, and then to see the community that we've been called to create as God does. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly by suggesting that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. And so we stand against forgetting that as best we can. And so we want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And fortunate for us, there are only 4 things that Jesus took seriously: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. If we embrace those 4 things, we are taking seriously what Jesus took seriously. I remember there was a homie named Bandit who was indeed a bandit. He was into his gang and gangbanging, and he was always selling crack cocaine, and I'd be on my bike in the middle of the night in Aliso village where he lived, and I'd see him run up to a car and make a sale of crack cocaine, and I wish I could say he was moderately embarrassed as he was counting his money, walking to me, straddling my bike, talking to his other homies, but he never was very much. And he always turned down any offer of help and said, "I'm okay." So then one day he walks into my office, and he never had before. And I was astounded, and I said, "Y ese milagro, that you would walk through our doors." And he said, "I'm tired of being tired." And so he began in our 18-month training program, and he inhabited the truth of who he was, and he met on speaking terms his true self and dignity and nobility. And he healed from a lifetime of trauma. For if you don't transform your pain, you'll just keep inflicting it. And afterwards, as we do, we have workforce development people who move you on after your 18 months. The hope is that this will be seamless so that you can go to your next job right after your 18 months with us. And that's what happened. We found him an entry-level job in a warehouse, and in no time at all, he was running the whole thing. He was the mero chingon of the whole warehouse. And 5 years into this, he, home and wife and 3 kids. Well, I hadn't heard from him in a long time, and one Friday afternoon, he kind of calls me with a little bit of panic in his voice, and he says, "Gee, you gotta bless my daughter." And I said, "¿Qué pasó, mijo? Is she sick? Is she in the hospital?" And he said, "Oh, no. On Sunday, she's going to Humboldt College. But that's far, and it's way up north, and she's a little chaparrita, my little Jessica, 18 years old, and do you think you could bless her before she goes?" And I said, I'd be honored. And so I said, look, tomorrow is Saturday. I have a 1 o'clock baptism. Why don't you come to the church at 12:30 and we'll do a little send-off. And sure enough, Bandit and his wife and the 3 kids, including tiny little Jessica, are there. And so I say, well, let's put Jessica, kind of in the middle here, and let's form a circle around her and everybody touch her. Put your hands on her shoulder. Go ahead, put your hands on her head. Bow your heads, close your eyes. And as the homies say, I do a long ass prayer. I go on. And somewhere in the middle of this prayer, I notice that we've all become chillones. We're all crying. I don't know why we're crying, except for the fact that Bandit and his wife don't know anybody who's ever gone to college except me. Certainly nobody in their families. And so we wipe away our tears and we're all kind of laughing at how mushy we got. So I kind of changed the subject and I said, Jessica, what are you going to study at Humboldt College? And she was very quick, forensic psychology. And I go, damn, forensic psychology. And Bandit chimes in, yeah, she wants to study the criminal mind. And Jessica turns and looks at her father and she kind of does deadpan like this, and he sees her and he says, yeah, I'm going to be her first subject. So we go out to the car and everybody piles in, but Bandit hangs back and I'm glad he has. And I look at him and I said, I give you credit for the man you've chosen to become, for choosing to walk in your own footsteps. I'm proud of you. And his eyes fill up with tears. And he says, ¿Sabes qué? I'm proud of myself. All my life, people called me a lowlife, a bueno para nada, a good for nothing. I guess I showed them. I said, yeah, I guess you did. And the soul feels its worth. Exactly what God had in mind. Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are, beloved, in whom I'm wonderfully pleased. And it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. Mother Teresa also said that the problem in the world is that we've drawn our family circles too small. The early Christian community was sort of noted by this fact in this greeting. They would greet the other members of the Christian family with a big old wet kiss on the lips. And the reason they did this was because the only people you ever did this with were your blood relatives. So the early Christian community, because they wanted to take seriously what Jesus took seriously, they greeted each other in this way to kind of announce this message. We're about something different here. We're about the creation of a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. The tender glance we receive from our exhausted God has a point and a purpose. That you may be one, Jesus says. That's kind of what's on God's mind. Where we think it's all about this, oh God, you're amazing. God is sort of saying, no, it's not about me. It's about you. It's about this community and this connection. And it's about greeting each other with a big old wet kiss. The poet Wallace Stevens says, we live in the description of the place, but not in the place itself. Christians hold out for the place itself, in the here and now, in a community of tenderness and kinship. At Homeboy, we're not that interested in the homies and homegirls surviving as the fittest, but thriving as the nurtured, that if it is true that the traumatized may well cause trauma, it's equally true that the cherished will find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others, which is the community of kinship and mutuality. Let me end with this story, and then I want to open it up to you. There was a kid named Danny who I met when he was 13 years old, and he always carried a gun, and he always made sure that you knew that he had one tucked into the front of his pants. He was a knucklehead, he was hard-headed, he was into his gang, he put in work, he did dirt, and he vowed to me once, I will never step foot in Homeboy Industries. And so I never knew him from my office. I knew him from, the streets. And then I knew him from juvenile hall. And then I knew him from youth authority facilities. And then finally at 18, he went to prison just for 2 years. In recovery, and the same with gang recovery, you would say it takes what it takes. For gang members, it takes what it takes. The birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. For Danny, what it took was to be released and to discover that his mother had 6 months to live, had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And so Danny had a lot of siblings, but he was the designated hospice caregiver. And I watched him with his mother. He was so tender and took care of her. All the more remarkable because this woman, in fact, tortured him. And she died. And a week later, I buried her. And a week after that, he walked into Homeboy Industries. And I watched him work side by side with enemies, with rivals, with guys I know that he used to shoot at. And I watched him get his GED finally, and then go on to East LA College, community college, to take some courses. One day he came into my office and very dramatically he said, "What happened to me yesterday has never happened in my life." And he proceeds to tell me that after work at 5 o'clock one day, he went across the street to the Gold Line at the Chinatown stop, and he was taking the train to go east, to go home. And he said it was a packed train, but he was able to get a seat. And he said standing right in front of him, hanging onto a pole, he said was a medio pedo guy, a guy who was a little bit drunk. He could see on his hands that there were tattoos, so he knew he was a gang member, but he didn't know who he was, an older guy. And Danny was wearing a sweatshirt that had this logo on it, but it filled the whole chest, and it said, "Jobs Not Jails, Homeboy Industries." And the drunk guy said, "Hey, you work there." And Danny doesn't know whether to engage him or not, but so he just nods. And the guy says, "Is it any good?" And Danny shrugs and he says, "It's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm ever going to go back to prison because of this place." So Danny stands and he fishes into his pocket and he finds a pen and a little blank piece of paper, and he writes on the piece of paper the address at Homeboy Industries. As he's telling me the story, he says, "I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart." So he finished writing it and he hands it to the guy and he says, "You come and see us. We'll help you." And the guy studies the piece of paper and he says, "Thank you." And the train stops and the guy gets off. And Danny sits down. And then in my office, he repeats that earlier refrain. What happened next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. And that's not the description of the place. That's the place itself. A community of kinship where people stand in awe at what the poor have to carry rather than in judgment. A community of tenderness, the only thing that can scale the walls of shame and disgrace. That's the place itself where we take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And so we greet each other with a big old fat wet kiss on the lips because we've received from our exhausted God this tender glance, and we don't know what to do with it except to be that tender glance in the world, which inoculates us from feeling that somehow our presence at the margins is a waste of time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you.
Father Greg, many applause in silence as everyone disputed. But I'm having a hard time processing everything that you have shared with us. And what a gift that you are here, that you're here with us, reminding us that especially in the midst of whether it's a pandemic or heartbreaking day-to-day exposure to what's happening in society with racial injustice, we want to be strong. We need to face this and act on it. But I appreciated the reminder of the wounds that we all have, because we have all been hurt in some way, shape, or form. And it's okay. And it's okay because it's part of our humanity, and that's part of what makes us vulnerable to those who need us. So we have lots of questions. And if I may start, you invite us to go to the margins. What happens when we go to the margins and we don't necessarily know what to do, or perhaps we're not invited and we just feel still with very, very good intentions to go to the margins?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You don't go to the margins to make a difference, because then it's about you. But you go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. And then it's about us. And that's sort of a key thing, it seems to me, because first of all, we burn out if we go to the margins to save, rescue, and fix people. And so the notion, of course, is always to go to the margins so that you enter into this exquisite mutuality where everybody is inhabiting their nobility and their dignity. And that's what happens. So, you know, we always get volunteers at Homeboy, you know, well-meaning people, and they'll say, well, what am I going to do here? And I always say, no, that's the wrong question. What's going to happen to you here? That's the question. And once a woman came to me and she said, I have to volunteer at Homeboy Industries. I said, oh my God, why do you have to volunteer at Homeboy Industries? She says, I believe I have a message these young people need to hear. And I went, yikes. And I told her, I said, look, the minute you lose that message, I hope you come back to us, because I don't want your damn message. I don't even want a messenger. You know, I was in Houston once, and a guy who was a former gang member, inmate, now what we call a hardcore gang intervention worker working in the streets with gang members. And he came, a really good guy, and he came up to me after my talk and he said, very earnestly, how do you reach them? And I found myself saying, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? And can you receive who they are? You know, I can't even believe this, but you know, it's probably how old I am. It's, you know, whatever it was, 40 years ago or something, 35 years. Anyway, I was taught a course during my theology years, and this was at Harvard Divinity, by Henry Nouwen and Parker Palmer, who were team teaching. And the course was a course on ministry. And somebody said, well, what is ministry? And Henry Nouwen was having a bad period in his life. He ended up going to L'Arche after that, but he said, kind of frustrated, he said, can you receive people? That's it. And I like that. I've never forgotten that either, that can you receive people? Otherwise, it's about you. You know, I kind of get frustrated, especially, you know, like a lot of my staff sometimes will come to me and they'll go, oh, I guess I'm just too compassionate because I'm burning out and I take the work home with me. And I go, no, that's, I've lost the screen. Is that okay? You all still there?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
A little glitch, you're fine.
Yeah, and I said, no, if you're depleted by this work, you've allowed it to become about you. But if you go to the margins so that you can be reached and you can receive people, then it's about us. And then it's eternally replenishing. But you don't go there with any task. That's the beauty of the thing. And so service is the hallway that leads you to the ballroom. And service is a good place to begin. But the ballroom is where that's where we're headed. The ballroom is the place of kinship and connection. And as you were mentioning, you know, our vulnerability is sort of the Velcro of our connection, of our kinship. It's what joins us, you know. And at Homeboy, we always kind of say, no, do the work. And the work means not allowing yourself to be a stranger to yourself. You know, don't bypass your pain. The only way through your pain is through your pain. And everybody, but you know, if you have ever bumped into the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Exposure or Experiences study, and it's a checklist of 10, and it's things like parent in prison, parent addicted, parent mentally ill, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. It's a list of 10. And so the experts on this, like Nadine Burke-Harris, who is our Surgeon General in the state of California, she wrote a book on it called The Deepest Well. And she says, in her own experience and study, that if a child is a 4 or a 5 on the ACEs, that's, oh my gosh, this kid is going to have health problems and socializing problems if they're a 4 or a 5. I'm a 0 on the ACEs, 0. I don't register one thing. And every homie and homegirl who walks through our doors at Homeboy Industries is a 9 or a 10 on the ACEs. I always say or 10 because the guys, I suspect more of them than they would ever want to be known, have been sexually abused. Certainly all the women have been, all of them. So a 9 or a 10, so try to wrap your mind around a 9 or a 10 on the ACEs. Then suddenly what that throws out of whack is your notion of good and evil, choice, sin, and it should, because not all choices are created equal. And I've never been asked to carry what the thousands and thousands of men and women I've been privileged to know have had to carry. So it's not so much about, I think the God of love looks at us and doesn't see sin. God sees son or daughter. And God sees wound. And in this country, we punish wound. We send them to prison. And it's not for nothing that the largest mental institution on the planet Earth is the LA County Jail. And that's because we don't see as God sees. There's a homie at Homeboy who's a navigator, Robert Wattis, who says, God knows where the thorn is underneath, which is brilliant. And so we all have that thorn underneath to the extent that we can connect to it. It's our own vulnerability and Velcro that joins us to each other. See, one question will lead to a long ass answer, and we probably only need one more, so go for it.
Let me get to one that's been seconded by a couple of folks. There's so many strong leaders with multiple levels of gifts to our church that provide gifts to our church. Yet sometimes women bring certain gifts to our church, but there doesn't seem to be that much space for women. What are your views? And if you can, give us some cheers for the role of women in our church today.
Yeah, I don't know. This question has often gotten me into trouble. Once it sent me to 30 days of prayer and penance. Little did the bishop know that I, delighted in having 30 days of prayer and penance. But yeah, I don't know how else you can see this except to say that unhealthy and probably sinful that we've excluded women from ordination and ministry. I mean, I don't know how else to see it. I don't think we have a leg to stand on traditionally or theologically or humanly. We don't have a leg to stand on, and it's always embarrassing when we try to find the leg to stand on in terms of tradition, theology, and just human decency. We don't have a leg to stand on. So, in the gospel, Jesus, God love him, and I'm a big Jesus fan, he sees this guy having seizures, and he and the whole crowd say, oh, he's possessed by a demon. Well, no, he wasn't. He had epilepsy. And in 2020, you can take medicine that will control your seizures. Jesus didn't know any better. He didn't know what epilepsy was. And that's okay. That doesn't diminish in any way my sense of Jesus. And certainly in the history of the church and in the time of Jesus, how there were slaves and the women were treated a certain way and there was hierarchy and there was second-class citizens. No, no sensible person thinks you can ever justify the exclusion of women from life in the church that's full and owns leadership and is ordained. I mean, there's just no way around it. And, you know, I'm a geezer, so I don't care anymore. But I just don't think it's an indefensible position. And you know, again, God wants us to have an inclusive church and to be as in, and that's just another name for God, is inclusion. And exclusion, which is what in fact, de facto happens with women, exclusion is the opposite of God. There's just no way around it. And once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods, including the one that thinks men are superior to women. Yikes, embarrassing. But there's no way around it except to say, embarrassing. So that'll get me into trouble, but I don't, you know, fire away.
Thank you. No, this, I just want to comment too, that you are getting so many accolades and thank yous for not only your energy, but certainly the message and the challenge. And you have greetings and thank yous all the way from Hawaii to Argentina, because we have an amazing representation of where our Marianist family is located at today. One last question, since and you spoke about, of course, the exhausted God, and especially in our days and our times, because I know many of us have a laundry list of prayers and we look up and we say, sorry, one more. What about you? How do you re-energize yourself in the midst of all this probably exhaustion that you yourself may be experiencing?
Well, you know, the trick in life is to kind of stay in the living room, you know, and the living room is where the living happens, which is, the living room for me represents the present moment in which you can delight, you know, or you can lament what happened yesterday, which is the bathroom, or you can be anxious about tomorrow, which is the kitchen. Now, it's a bad analogy because everybody needs the bathroom and the kitchen. But my point is, stay anchored in the present moment, and then you're delighting in what's right in front of you. And I think that's key. And that's the hope, you know, is that somehow we delight in, as God does, in the present moment and the person right in front of it. I believe that God protects me from nothing and sustains me in everything. And that's enough for me, you know, that somehow we get sustained as we try to grapple with systemic racism and how pervasive it is, that somehow we will be sustained in a pandemic. On Monday, I'm going to bury a homie who died of COVID here in Los Angeles. I've known him for 30 years. And so his body will be there. And the day after this homie died in Los Angeles, his father died of the virus in Las Vegas the very next day. So it'll be a double funeral on Monday. Father and son, both killed by this pandemic. So for anyone who wants to say that wearing a mask conflicts with their own rights, shame on you. Smart people wear masks, and people who care about other people wear masks, period. And so what you want to do is to know this God of love who sustains us in everything, but sustains us mainly in the present moment. And I'll just end with the story, because I always end with the story. You know, we have a lot of classes at Homeboy, and anger management and grief and loss and yoga and meditation and 12-step classes. And we have a class called Art Heals. And it's run by a wonderful woman named Laura. And she always, and you wouldn't think this would be such a success with big old tattooed gang members. Arts and crafts and watercolors and stuff like that. Oh my God, they love it. So I remember it was the class the week before we closed for Christmas. And she brought in all these prefab gingerbread houses, you know, in pieces. So walls, doors, thatched roofs, that they had to glue together with icing and piping. And then they could also adorn it with M&Ms and gummies and have a little pathway to the door. Okay. So I'm in my office with two homies talking to them. And in comes this little kid, Francisco. In our 32-year history, he's the tiniest kid who's ever worked at Homeboy. He could be a jockey. He's so tiny, covered in tattoos. And he comes in with this kind of cardboard mat with his gingerbread house on it. And he comes to my desk and he carefully plants it in the middle of my desk. And this kid, I don't think, has said 2 words to me ever before. He's so shy. And with so much emotion, he says, "I made this for you." And I said, "Oh my God, Francisco, I don't know what to say. I'm so grateful." And so the 4 of us are staring at this house, and there's a beat. And then, almost as if on cue, the walls fall down and the roof collapses on itself. And we're staring silently at this rubble and ruined house. And one of the older homies says, "Damn, Section 8 housing." Oh my God, we just collapsed on each other, laughing so hard. And that's delighting in the present moment, but that also is not the description of the place. That's the place itself. Thank you all very much.
Amen.
God bless you. And God bless my friends Brandon and Michael to be ordained on August 22 in St. Louis. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Everybody, we had at the beginning of the chat before questions, the website to Homeboy Industries in case you would like to learn a little bit more about Father Greg's ministry. What an amazing hour-and-a-half we've had. Katie, take it away.
Thanks so much. God protects me.